On the morning of September 21st, 2001, just 10 days after the September 11th terrorist attacks had transformed American intelligence priorities, FBI Special Agent Stephen McCoy, identified in investigative reports, stood in the hallway outside apartment 417 on New Hampshire Avenue in northwest Washington, D.C., preparing to arrest a woman who had been spying for Cuba for 16 years. It was approximately 6:15 a.m., and the weather that morning was cool and clear, the first hints of autumn evident in the sharp morning air. McCoy, 39 years old, had been assigned to the FBI's Washington Field Office Counterintelligence Division for 7 years. The arrest he was about to make would expose one of the most damaging penetrations of U.S. intelligence in modern history, committed not by a foreign agent who had infiltrated American institutions, but by an American citizen who had chosen ideology over loyalty. The target of the arrest was Ana Belén Montes, a 44-year-old senior analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency who held the position of Cuba Analyst, the federal government's most senior expert on Cuban military and political affairs. Her apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit that she had occupied since 1992, was located in a quiet residential neighborhood populated largely by young professionals and government workers. According to DIA personnel records, Montes had worked for the agency since 1985, 16 years, during which she had been granted access to some of the most sensitive intelligence information the United States government possessed regarding Cuba and other Latin American matters. At exactly 6:22 a.m., after receiving confirmation that all exits from the building were secured, McCoy knocked on the door of apartment 417. The knock was firm, but not aggressive. The arrest was planned to proceed as quietly and professionally as possible, both to maintain operational security and to avoid alerting other residents of the building to what was happening. According to McCoy's later testimony, Montes opened the door after approximately 15 seconds. She was wearing a bathrobe over pajamas and appeared to have just woken up. Her expression, McCoy would later recall, showed neither surprise nor alarm. Instead, she looked at the agents with what appeared to be resignation, as if she had been expecting this moment for a long time. McCoy identified himself and the other agents present, then informed Montes that she was under arrest for conspiracy to commit espionage. He advised her of her rights according to the Miranda warning and asked if she understood. According to the lead agent's report, Montes nodded, said she understood, and asked if she could get dressed. The agents allowed her to change clothes under the supervision of a female FBI agent, then handcuffed her and escorted her from the apartment to an unmarked sedan waiting on the street below. As the vehicle carrying Montes pulled away from New Hampshire Avenue that morning, heading toward FBI headquarters for interrogation, very few people in the United States intelligence community understood the full scope of what she had done. In the hours and days that followed, as investigators examined the evidence gathered during the investigation and as Montes herself began to provide information during interrogations, the extent of her duplicity would become clear. For 16 years, from 1985 until her arrest in 2001, Ana Montes had been systematically providing classified information to Cuban intelligence services. She had compromised sources, revealed operations, exposed intelligence-gathering methods, and shaped U.S. policy toward Cuba in ways that served Cuban interests rather than American ones. Intelligence officials conducting damage assessments would eventually conclude that Montes had caused more harm to U.S. national security interests regarding Cuba than any other spy in American history. Before we continue with Ana Montes's story, how an American analyst became Cuba's most valuable spy and sustained her deception for 16 years, if you're interested in the hidden operations of Cold War intelligence and the real human consequences of espionage, Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We document these cases every week, bringing you the facts behind some of history's most significant intelligence operations. To understand how Ana Montes arrived at that moment, standing in her apartment doorway at 6:22 a.m., facing FBI agents who were about to end her 16-year operation, requires going back to the beginning. Ana Belén Montes was born on February 28, 1957, in Augsburg, West Germany, where her father, Alberto Montes, was stationed as a U.S. Army physician. Her mother, Emilia, was a homemaker who had been born in Puerto Rico and had met Alberto while he was completing his medical training. Ana was the oldest of 4 children. The family was bilingual, speaking both English and Spanish at home, and maintained strong connections to Puerto Rican culture despite living on military bases in Germany and later in the United States. According to FBI background investigations and interviews with family members conducted after Montes's arrest, her childhood was outwardly conventional but marked by significant family tensions. Alberto Montes was described by those who knew him as authoritarian and volatile, with a temper that sometimes manifested in verbal and, according to some accounts, physical abuse directed at his wife and children. Ana, as the oldest child, appears to have taken on a protective role toward her younger siblings, particularly her sister Lucy, who was 3 years younger, and her brothers Tito and Alberto Jr. The family moved several times during Anna's childhood as Alberto's military assignments changed. They lived in Kansas, then in Iowa, before finally settling in Towson, Maryland, outside Baltimore, in 1969, when Anna was 12 years old. It was in Maryland that Anna attended middle school and high school, proving herself to be an exceptional student with particular strengths in languages and social studies. Teachers from Loch Raven High School, when interviewed years later, remembered Anna as intelligent, serious, and somewhat reserved, a student who completed assignments meticulously and who seemed driven by internal standards rather than external validation. In 1975, Anna enrolled at the University of Virginia, studying foreign affairs with a focus on Latin America. According to university records, she graduated magna cum laude in 1979. Her academic performance was outstanding. She consistently earned top grades and impressed professors with her analytical capabilities and her command of Spanish. She spent the summer of 1978 studying abroad in Spain, further refining her language skills. By all accounts, she was a model student headed toward a successful career in international affairs or government service. After graduation, Montes worked briefly for the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., in a clerical position while she decided on her long-term career path. In 1981, she began graduate studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, one of the most prestigious graduate programs for students pursuing careers in foreign policy and international relations. Her focus continued to be on Latin American affairs, and she completed a master's degree in 1985, the same year she began working at the Defense Intelligence Agency. These were the years when Ana Montes's political convictions, her intellectual engagement with Latin American affairs, and her sense of moral certainty converged in a way that Cuban intelligence would skillfully exploit. It was during her time at Johns Hopkins that Ana Montes began to develop the political convictions that would eventually lead to her decision to commit espionage. The early and mid-1980s were a period of intense debate about U.S. policy in Central America. The Reagan administration was providing military and financial support to anti-communist forces in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and elsewhere in the region, while critics argued that this support was propping up brutal dictatorships and contributing to human rights abuses. Ana Montes, according to her own later statements, and according to people who knew her during this period, became increasingly convinced that U.S. policy toward Latin America was imperialistic, hypocritical, and harmful. Her political awakening appears to have been particularly influenced by events in Nicaragua, where the U.S.-backed Contra rebels were fighting against the Sandinista government. Montes attended protests, participated in campus debates, and began to view U.S. foreign policy through an increasingly critical lens. She came to believe that the United States was the primary obstacle to social justice and self-determination in Latin America, and that Cuba, despite its authoritarian government, represented a valid alternative model that was being unfairly demonized by American propaganda. In December 1984, while still a graduate student at Johns Hopkins, Montes was approached in New York City by a Cuban intelligence officer who recognized her as someone whose views aligned with Cuban interests and who might be susceptible to recruitment. The exact details of this initial contact remain classified, but according to information that emerged during Montes's interrogation and prosecution, the Cuban officer engaged her in conversation about Latin American politics and U.S. foreign policy, quickly identifying her potential value. The recruitment itself was gradual. Over several months, Montes had multiple conversations with Cuban intelligence representatives. They appealed to her political convictions, arguing that she could help counteract what they characterized as aggressive and destructive U.S. policies by providing Cuba with information that would allow it to defend itself. They did not frame the recruitment as treason, but rather as an act of conscience, as contributing to peace and justice by helping to level an uneven playing field between a powerful superpower and a small besieged island nation. By early 1985, according to the FBI's reconstruction of events, Montes had agreed to work for Cuban intelligence. She had not yet begun her position at the Defense Intelligence Agency. That would not happen until September of that year, but she had committed herself to the Cuban cause and had agreed to provide whatever information she could access. The Cubans provided her with basic training in tradecraft, how to communicate securely, how to handle classified information, how to avoid detection. They also instructed her on what types of information would be most valuable to Cuban intelligence. Having committed herself to Cuban intelligence in early 1985, Montes now faced the challenge of positioning herself where she could access the information Cuba most valued. Montes joined the Defense Intelligence Agency in September 1985, assigned to the Caribbean desk. Within a short time, she was working specifically on Cuba-related intelligence. This assignment gave her access to classified information about U.S. intelligence operations targeting Cuba, about Cuban military capabilities, about Cuban political leadership and internal dynamics, and about U.S. policy deliberations regarding Cuba. She had access not only to information collected by DIA, but also to intelligence from other agencies, including the CIA, NSA, and military intelligence services, as intelligence products were shared across the U.S. intelligence community based on Analyst's areas of responsibility. For Cuban intelligence services, having an asset like Ana Montes was extraordinarily valuable. The United States maintained extensive intelligence collection operations targeting Cuba, including signals intelligence, satellite imagery, human sources, and more. Understanding what the United States knew about Cuba, what operations were being planned, what sources were providing information, and how U.S. policymakers viewed Cuban actions gave Cuba crucial advantages. They could take countermeasures to protect their own operations, could eliminate or neutralize U.S. intelligence sources, could shape their own actions to avoid U.S. detection or to manipulate U.S. perceptions, and could plan their diplomatic and military strategies with better understanding of U.S. intentions. Montes's method of communication with her Cuban handlers evolved over the 16 years of her espionage activities, but it followed certain consistent patterns designed to minimize the risk of detection. She never had face-to-face meetings with Cuban intelligence officers in the United States, as such meetings would have been too risky given FBI surveillance of Cuban diplomats and known intelligence officers. Instead, she received instructions and provided information through indirect methods. The primary method involved shortwave radio broadcasts. At prearranged times, Montes would use a shortwave radio receiver to listen to specific frequencies where Cuban intelligence would broadcast encrypted messages. These broadcasts, known as numbers stations, consisted of groups of numbers read aloud that, to anyone listening without the proper decryption key, were meaningless. Montes had been provided with a system for decrypting these messages, which would contain instructions for her: what information to collect, when, and how to transmit it, arrangements for any upcoming travel or meetings. To transmit information to Cuba, Montes primarily used encrypted messages sent via pagers. She would encode the information using a system the Cubans had provided, then call a pager number from a public payphone and enter the coded information as a numeric message. The pager signal would be received in Cuba, where it would be decoded. This method was secure because the messages were encrypted, brief, and transmitted through a system that did not require Montes to have any direct contact with Cuban intelligence officers or communication facilities. For longer or more detailed information that could not be transmitted via pager, Montes traveled to meet with Cuban intelligence officers outside the United States. Case files document that she traveled to countries including Mexico and Spain to meet with her handlers, though the exact number and frequency of such trips has not been publicly disclosed. During these trips, she would provide documents, briefings, and updates in person. The information Montes provided to Cuba over 16 years was extensive and devastating to U.S. intelligence operations. According to declassified portions of the damage assessment conducted after her arrest, she provided information about U.S. intelligence officers working undercover in Cuba, details about collection programs targeting Cuba, including technical capabilities and methods being employed, information about U.S. military plans and contingencies related to Cuba, insights into senior policymakers' deliberations regarding Cuba policy, details about other Latin American countries' cooperation with U.S. intelligence operations, and information about Cuban refugees and defectors who were cooperating with U.S. intelligence. According to testimony from intelligence officials during Montes's prosecution, her position gave her access to nearly everything the U.S. intelligence community knew about Cuba and the ability to influence how that information was interpreted and presented to policymakers. What made Montes particularly effective as a spy was not just her access to classified information, but also her role as an analyst. As the senior Cuba analyst at DIA, she was not simply collecting information, she was interpreting it, assessing it, and presenting conclusions based on it. This meant she could subtly shape the intelligence products that reached senior officials and policymakers. If Cuban intelligence wanted the United States to underestimate Cuban military capabilities in a certain area, Montes could emphasize evidence that supported that conclusion. If Cuba wanted to direct U.S. attention toward one issue and away from another, Montes could craft her analysis to highlight certain threats and downplay others. This analytical influence allowed Cuba to manipulate U.S. perceptions and decision-making at a systemic level. Policymakers were making decisions based on intelligence assessments that appeared authoritative and objective, but that were actually being shaped by someone working on behalf of a foreign government. The full extent of this influence could never be fully quantified because it was impossible to determine with certainty which of Montes's analytical judgments were honest assessments and which were shaped by her loyalty to Cuba. Throughout the 16 years of her espionage, Montes maintained a carefully constructed cover as a dedicated professional intelligence analyst. Her personnel evaluations were consistently excellent. Supervisors described her as meticulous, hard-working, and highly knowledgeable. She received awards and recognition for her work. She was promoted through the DIA's analytical ranks, eventually reaching the level of GS-14, a senior civil service grade. In 1997, 4 years before her arrest, she was awarded the Certificate of Distinction, one of DIA's highest honors, recognizing her outstanding service. Her colleagues generally found her professional but somewhat distant. She did not socialize extensively outside of work, maintaining what many described as a private, personal life. She was known for working long hours, often staying late at the office or taking work home. This dedication was seen as professionalism, but it also provided her with opportunities to access and copy classified information without arousing suspicion. Montes lived modestly. Her apartment on New Hampshire Avenue was small and sparsely furnished. She drove a used car. She dressed conservatively, typically wearing business suits appropriate for a government analyst, but nothing flashy or expensive. According to financial records reviewed during the FBI investigation, she lived comfortably within her government salary, which by 2001 was approximately $75,000 per year. There were no large, unexplained deposits, no sudden purchases of expensive items, no lifestyle that suggested she was receiving significant payments from a foreign government. This financial profile was, according to FBI analysis, consistent with Montes's motivation for espionage. Unlike many spies who are motivated primarily by money, Montes appeared to be motivated by ideology. The Cubans did pay her for her services. According to later testimony, she received modest cash payments, estimated at a few $1,000s per year, during her trips abroad to meet with handlers. But these payments were nominal compared to the value of the information she provided. She was not spying to get rich. She was spying because she believed in the cause. Montes's personal life during the years of her espionage was notably isolated. She never married. She had relationships with men, but they tended to be brief and apparently not deeply intimate. According to interviews the FBI conducted with people who knew her, Montes was guarded about her personal life and her inner thoughts. She had a small circle of friends, mostly other Latin America-focused professionals with whom she would occasionally socialize. She maintained contact with her family, particularly her sister Lucy, but even family members later described feeling that Anna kept parts of herself hidden. One relationship that would become significant in the investigation was with a fellow DIA analyst who later transferred to a position at CIA. The two had been romantically involved in the mid-1990s, and they remained friendly after the relationship ended. This man, whose identity has not been publicly disclosed, would eventually provide information that, according to some accounts, contributed to the suspicions leading to Montes being investigated. For 11 years, from 1985 to 1996, Montes operated with remarkable success, her espionage undetected despite the sensitivity of the information she was compromising. That would begin to change in 1996. The investigation that ultimately led to Montes's arrest began in 1996, 5 years before she was taken into custody. The trigger was information from a Cuban intelligence defector who revealed that Cuba had a high-level penetration of U.S. intelligence with access to extremely sensitive information about Cuba operations, according to declassified accounts of the investigation. The defector could not identify the penetration by name, but provided details about the type of information Cuba was receiving, which suggested someone with comprehensive access to U.S. intelligence community products related to Cuba. This information, combined with signals intelligence anomalies detected by NSA, led the FBI to open an investigation codenamed Barefoot. The challenge was enormous. Thousands of U.S. government employees had access to classified information about Cuba to varying degrees. The investigation focused on identifying individuals who had both the access to provide the kind of information Cuba appeared to have and some indicator of potential disloyalty or foreign contact. Anna Montes emerged as a priority target through convergent factors. Her position as senior Cuba analyst at DIA gave her comprehensive access to Cuba-related intelligence across the entire U.S. government. If someone was leaking information of the scope the defector described, she would have been in an ideal position to do so. Work pattern anomalies raised questions. She occasionally declined certain operations or requests to participate in briefings without clear justification, and counterintelligence analysts reviewing her career history noted she had requested assignment to Cuba matters early in her career and had remained focused on that area for nearly her entire time at DIA. The former boyfriend, who now worked at CIA, mentioned Montes to a counterintelligence colleague, noting that she had asked him on several occasions about operations he was involved in, questions that went beyond casual curiosity, and that she had once made a comment suggesting sympathy for Cuba's position in its relationship with the United States. None of this was conclusive, but it was enough to elevate Montes to a higher priority for scrutiny. For 4 years, from 1996 to 2000, the investigation proceeded carefully, narrowing the field of suspects. Beginning in 2000, once Montes had emerged as the primary focus, the FBI intensified its investigation. This investigation was extraordinarily sensitive because Montes continued to work at DIA with access to highly classified information. If she was indeed a Cuban spy and became aware she was under investigation, she could warn her handlers, flee the country, or destroy evidence. The investigation had to be conducted in complete secrecy. The FBI obtained authorization for enhanced surveillance. They monitored her apartment, though they could not enter it without risk of detection. They tracked her movements, documenting her routine, her drive to work, her occasional shopping trips, her rare social outings. They analyzed her communication patterns, reviewing phone records and looking for any suspicious contacts. The surveillance produced evidence that was concerning but not yet conclusive. Agents observed that Montes would occasionally visit a public payphone several blocks from her apartment, typically on weekend mornings, and make brief calls. The timing of these calls appeared to follow a pattern. They occurred on certain weekends, but not others, suggesting a schedule rather than random personal calls. Phone records showed the calls were placed to pager numbers, but the messages sent could not be recovered. Investigators also obtained permission to search Montes's workspace at DIA headquarters during off hours when she was not present. These searches, conducted with meticulous care to avoid leaving any trace of entry, revealed that Montes kept personal storage devices in her desk that were not part of the standard DIA computer systems. She also kept handwritten notes in Spanish that appeared to be encrypted or coded in some way. The most significant break in the investigation came from signals intelligence. The National Security Agency, which monitors foreign communications, had been tracking encrypted shortwave radio broadcasts originating from Cuba and aimed at the United States. These broadcasts, consisting of strings of numbers read aloud in Spanish, were suspected to be Cuban intelligence communicating with agents in the United States, but NSA had not been able to decrypt them or identify who might be receiving them. When the FBI investigation focused on Montes, agents requested enhanced surveillance of her apartment to determine if she possessed a shortwave radio receiver and whether she might be listening to broadcasts at certain times. Using sensitive electronic monitoring equipment, FBI technical surveillance specialists detected that Montes was indeed operating a shortwave radio in her apartment and that she was tuning to the specific frequencies where the Cuban broadcasts occurred. This discovery was crucial. It established a communication link between Montes and Cuban intelligence and provided strong evidence that she was actively engaged in espionage. However, the FBI still needed to catch her in the act of passing information or to gather enough evidence to prove that she had committed specific crimes. The decision about when to arrest Montes became urgent in September 2001 for reasons unrelated to the investigation itself. On September 11, 2001, when al-Qaeda terrorists attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the U.S. intelligence community immediately shifted into crisis mode. Senior analysts across all agencies were called in to provide briefings and assessments related to the attacks, terrorism threats, and potential U.S. responses. Anna Montes, as a senior DIA analyst, would likely have been involved in briefings and would have had access to intelligence related to the terrorism crisis and to U.S. military planning. FBI officials realized that if Montes was a Cuban spy, allowing her to continue working with access to information during this critical period posed unacceptable risks. Even though Cuba was not directly involved in the 9/11 attacks, the information about U.S. capabilities, plans, and vulnerabilities that Montes might access during this period could be of significant value to Cuban intelligence and potentially could be shared with other hostile actors. The decision was made to arrest Montes immediately rather than wait for additional evidence. The FBI believed they had sufficient evidence to charge her with conspiracy to commit espionage based on the surveillance, the shortwave radio monitoring, the suspicious communication patterns, and the classified materials found in her workspace. On the morning of September 21, 2001, Ana Montes was taken into custody. Following her arrest, FBI agents executed a search warrant for her apartment. The search, which lasted several hours, produced substantial evidence. Agents found a shortwave radio receiver of the type commonly used to receive number station broadcasts, documents and notes in encrypted or coded form, computer equipment including laptops and storage devices, instructions for operating covert communication systems, and materials relating to her meetings with Cuban intelligence officers outside the United States. According to FBI reports, Montes initially exercised her right to remain silent during interrogation. However, over several days of questioning and after being presented with the evidence against her, she began to cooperate. She admitted that she had been working for Cuban intelligence since 1985. She provided details about her recruitment, her training, her methods of communication, and the general types of information she had provided, though she declined to provide specifics about certain operations or sources, stating that doing so would endanger people. Montes's explanation of her motivations echoed what investigators had already concluded. She had committed espionage because of political conviction. She stated that she believed U.S. policy toward Cuba was unjust and aggressive, that Cuba had the right to defend itself, and that by providing information to Cuba, she was helping to prevent what she characterized as U.S. aggression. She expressed no regret for her actions, though she acknowledged that she understood she had broken the law and would face consequences. The damage assessment conducted by the Defense Intelligence Agency and other elements of the U.S. intelligence community took months to complete. Investigators had to review 16 years of Montes's work, identify what classified information she had accessed, determine what she had likely provided to Cuban intelligence, and evaluate the impact of that compromise. The assessment concluded that Montes had caused damage that was exceptionally grave to national security. Intelligence officials testified that she had compromised virtually every significant U.S. intelligence program related to Cuba. She had revealed sources whose identities, once known to Cuban intelligence, would have rendered them useless or worse. She had exposed technical collection capabilities, likely forcing the United States to develop new methods at significant cost. She had provided Cuba with insights into U.S. military planning that could affect any future confrontation between the two countries. Ana Montes was charged in federal district court with conspiracy to commit espionage. The charge carried a potential sentence of up to life in prison. Her defense attorney, Plato Caceres, a prominent Washington lawyer who had represented other high-profile defendants in espionage cases, immediately began negotiations with federal prosecutors about the possibility of a plea agreement. The negotiations were complicated by several factors. The government wanted Montes to plead guilty to avoid a trial, which would likely involve the presentation of classified information and would be logistically difficult and potentially damaging to intelligence sources and methods. However, prosecutors also wanted a significant sentence that would reflect the severity of Montes's crimes and would serve as a deterrent to others. Montes, for her part, appeared willing to accept responsibility for her actions, but was not willing to express remorse or to provide extensive cooperation that would involve identifying specific Cuban intelligence operations or endangering individuals. According to people familiar with the negotiations, Montes maintained that she had committed espionage for principled reasons and that she would accept the legal consequences but would not betray Cuba or individuals who had trusted her. In October 2002, 13 months after her arrest, Ana Montes entered a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage in exchange for the government's agreement not to seek additional charges and to recommend a specific sentence. That sentence, as outlined in the plea agreement, was 25 years in federal prison. The plea hearing took place on October 16, 2002, before U.S. District Judge Ricardo Urbina in federal court in Washington, D.C. According to court transcripts, Judge Urbina carefully reviewed the plea agreement, questioned Montes directly about whether she understood the charges and was entering the plea voluntarily, and reviewed the factual basis for the plea to ensure it was supported by evidence. When given the opportunity to address the court, Montes made a brief statement. She acknowledged that she had provided information to Cuban intelligence over a period of 16 years. She stated that she had done so because she believed U.S. policy toward Cuba was wrong and harmful. She expressed no regret for her actions, stating that she had acted according to her conscience and was prepared to accept the consequences. The statement was notable for what it did not include: any apology, any expression of remorse, any acknowledgement that her actions had harmed U.S. national security or had compromised the trust of her colleagues and country. Judge Urbina accepted the plea agreement and imposed the agreed-upon sentence of 25 years. In his sentencing remarks, he noted the extraordinary seriousness of espionage offenses and the damage Montes had caused to national security. He stated that the sentence reflected both the need for punishment and the need to deter others who might consider such actions. Montes was designated to serve her sentence at Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, a federal prison facility that houses female inmates and provides medical and mental health services. She began serving her sentence in November 2002. The impact of Montes's espionage extended far beyond the specific intelligence she compromised. Her case forced the U.S. intelligence community to confront significant vulnerabilities in its counterintelligence practices and to implement reforms aimed at preventing similar penetrations in the future. One major issue the Montes case highlighted was the difficulty of detecting ideologically motivated spies. Unlike spies motivated primarily by financial gain, who often exhibit suspicious financial patterns such as unexplained wealth or significant debts that suddenly disappear, ideologically motivated spies like Montes can maintain completely normal financial profiles. Montes lived modestly, had no unusual financial transactions, and gave no financial indications that she was receiving payments from a foreign government. Traditional counterintelligence indicators, financial problems, drug or alcohol abuse, close associations with foreign nationals, foreign travel that raises questions, were largely absent in Montes's case. The primary indicators that eventually led to her identification were the pattern of suspicious behavior combined with her position and access, information from the Cuban defector, and finally the technical surveillance that detected her covert communications. The Montes case also raised questions about the process by which individuals receive security clearances and maintain access to classified information. Montes had held a security clearance since 1985, and throughout her career she had undergone periodic background investigations as required to maintain that clearance. None of these investigations had uncovered her espionage activities or even flagged her as a particular concern. Critics of the security clearance system pointed out that background investigations primarily focused on verifiable facts, financial records, criminal history, references, rather than on indicators of divided loyalty or ideological extremism. A person who pays their bills on time, has no criminal record, and whose references speak well of them can receive and maintain a clearance even if their political views or ideological commitments might raise questions about their reliability. The Defense Intelligence Agency conducted an internal review of its security practices following Montes's arrest. The review identified several procedural weaknesses, including insufficient monitoring of how analysts accessed classified information systems, inadequate oversight of what materials analysts printed or copied, and a general cultural assumption that senior analysts who had served loyally for years could be trusted without continued scrutiny. Reforms implemented in the aftermath of the Montes case included enhanced monitoring of classified computer systems to track what information analysts accessed and when, more frequent and more intrusive background investigations for analysts with access to highly sensitive information, and improved counterintelligence training to help supervisors and colleagues identify potential indicators of divided loyalty or espionage. For Montes's family, the revelation of her espionage was devastating. Her sister Lucy, her brother Tito, and her brother Alberto Jr. had no knowledge of her activities. In interviews conducted after her arrest, family members expressed shock and disbelief. Lucy, who was perhaps closest to Anna, later described struggling to reconcile the sister she knew, intelligent, principled, dedicated, with the spy who had compromised her country for 16 years. Lucy Montes eventually spoke publicly about her sister's case, giving interviews to journalists in which she acknowledged the complexity of her feelings. She stated that she still loved her sister, but could not understand or excuse what she had done. She described the experience of visiting Anna in prison as deeply disorienting. The sister she was speaking to across the table was the same person she had known all her life, with the same voice, the same mannerisms, the same intelligence. But that person had sustained a 16-year deception, had lived an entirely double existence, had valued an ideological commitment to a foreign government more than honesty with her own family. Lucy eventually reduced her visits, not because she stopped loving her sister, but because she no longer knew which version of Anna was real. Years later, Lucy would describe the hardest part not as the compromise of national security, but the duplicity within the family, the discovery that every conversation, every confidence, every moment of apparent intimacy had occurred while Anna maintained her secret allegiance to Cuba. She also expressed sympathy for the people Anna's espionage had harmed, including intelligence officers whose identities she had compromised and Cuban refugees who may have faced retaliation because of information Anna provided. Montes's parents were elderly by the time of their daughter's arrest. According to people who knew them, they were bewildered and ashamed. Alberto, the former army physician who had served his country during the Cold War, struggled to understand how his daughter could have committed espionage on behalf of a communist government. Emilia maintained some contact with Anna in prison, but found the visits difficult and emotionally painful. The family, once close despite its tensions, was fractured by Anna's choices in ways that could never be repaired. Within the U.S. intelligence community, reactions to Montes's case were mixed. Some felt that the 25-year sentence was appropriate given the damage she had caused and her lack of remorse. Others believed that she should have received a life sentence without parole, viewing her crimes as among the most serious forms of disloyalty. A few, though they acknowledged that she had broken the law and deserved punishment, expressed a degree of understanding for the ideological motivations that had driven her actions, even while condemning those actions. The debate reflected broader questions about whether ideological espionage should be viewed differently from financially motivated espionage, and whether spies who act on principle are more or less contemptible than those who betray for money. Cuban officials never publicly acknowledged that Ana Montes had worked for Cuban intelligence. This is standard practice for intelligence services, which rarely confirm or deny specific operations even after they have been exposed. However, unofficial reactions from Cuban intelligence veterans who spoke to journalists suggested that they viewed Montes as having been exceptionally valuable and that her arrest was considered a significant loss. Some Cuban officials and sympathizers portrayed Montes as a hero who had acted according to her conscience to resist U.S. imperialism. These characterizations, which appeared in Cuban state media and in publications sympathetic to Cuba, framed her espionage not as disloyalty, but as principled resistance to an unjust policy. In the United States, these sympathetic portrayals of Montes were met with anger from intelligence officials, prosecutors, and others who viewed her espionage as straightforward treason that had damaged national security and had potentially endangered lives. The debate over how to view Montes as a traitor, as a principled dissident, as an ideologue, as a spy, reflected broader disagreements about U.S. Cuba relations, about the nature of loyalty and deception, and about whether ideological motivations for espionage should be viewed differently from financial motivations. Ana Montes served 20 years of her 25-year sentence before being released on parole in January 2023. Her release, at age 65, occurred after she had demonstrated good behavior in prison and after the parole board determined that she no longer posed a threat to national security. The conditions of her parole included restrictions on her communications, travel, and employment, as well as requirements for monitoring and regular check-ins with a parole officer. The announcement of her release generated controversy. Some intelligence officials and veterans expressed concern that someone who had caused such damage to national security and who had never expressed remorse was being released at all. Others pointed out that she had served the vast majority of her sentence and that under federal sentencing guidelines she was entitled to consideration for parole. Upon her release, Montes relocated to Puerto Rico, where some of her family had roots. She has maintained a low profile, declining interview requests and avoiding public attention. According to people familiar with her situation, she lives modestly and maintains limited contact with family members. In interviews she gave before her release to researchers studying espionage cases, Montes maintained the positions she had articulated at the time of her plea. She stated that she had acted according to her conscience, that she believed U.S. policy toward Cuba was unjust, and that she had sought to help Cuba defend itself. The question of whether Ana Montes caused deaths or directly led to physical harm to specific individuals remains partially classified. Damage assessments from her case have not been fully released to the public, and intelligence officials have declined to provide details about whether specific intelligence sources were killed or imprisoned as a result of her actions. What is known is that she compromised U.S. intelligence officers operating in Cuba, and that she provided information about Cuban refugees and defectors who were cooperating with U.S. intelligence. The fate of those individuals has not been publicly disclosed, but the historical record of how authoritarian governments treat those identified as cooperating with foreign intelligence suggests that the consequences were likely severe. The counterintelligence professionals who investigated Montes have reflected on what made her case particularly difficult. Scott Carmichael, a DIA counterintelligence investigator who played a key role in the investigation, later described Montes as one of the most challenging cases he had encountered because she had been so careful, so disciplined, and so committed to her espionage activities. Unlike some spies who become careless over time or who exhibit behavioral changes that draw attention, Montes maintained her operational security for 16 years, never deviating from her careful routines, never allowing personal relationships to compromise her mission, never exhibiting the financial indiscretions or lifestyle changes that often expose spies. As McCoy later reflected on that moment when Montes opened her door that September morning, her calm demeanor suggested she had always known this day might come and had accepted it as a potential cost of her choices. He described her as someone who had made a conscious decision to prioritize her ideological commitments over her personal freedom and her obligations to her country, and who appeared at peace with the consequences even as those consequences became reality. The Montes case continues to be studied in counterintelligence training programs as an example of the challenges posed by ideologically motivated spies, the importance of technical surveillance in detecting covert communications, and the damage that can be caused by a single penetration at a senior analytical level. Declassified case studies of her espionage have been used to train new generations of intelligence officers in recognizing indicators of potential insider threats and in understanding how adversary intelligence services recruit and handle agents. For the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Montes case represented both a significant counterintelligence failure and an eventual success. The failure was in not detecting her espionage for 16 years, despite multiple opportunities when closer scrutiny might have revealed her activities. The success was in ultimately identifying her, building a case against her, and bringing her to justice, albeit after substantial damage had been done. The case forced the agency to confront uncomfortable truths about its own vulnerabilities and to implement reforms that, while they could not undo the damage Montes had caused, might prevent the next penetration. The question of how to prevent another Ana Montes remains challenging. Intelligence agencies need analysts who are intelligent, curious, and capable of understanding foreign perspectives, the very qualities that made Montes valuable as an analyst. But those same qualities, combined with ideological commitments and susceptibility to recruitment, can turn an analyst into a spy. The line between understanding a foreign adversary's perspective and sympathizing with that adversary to the point of disloyalty is not always clear, and intelligence agencies continue to struggle with how to identify when an analyst has crossed that line. Some counterintelligence officials have argued that the most effective defense against insider threats is cultural, creating an organizational culture where colleagues look out for each other, where concerning behaviors are reported, and where security is viewed as everyone's responsibility rather than just the responsibility of security officers. Others emphasize the importance of technical security measures, such as monitoring of computer systems and communications that can detect suspicious patterns even if behavioral indicators are absent. The reality is that both approaches are necessary, and even with both in place, a sufficiently careful and committed spy like Ana Montes can evade detection for years. The debate over whether ideologically motivated espionage should be viewed differently from financially motivated espionage continues without resolution. Some argue that spies who compromise their country for money are more contemptible because their motivation is purely selfish, while those who spy for ideological reasons are at least acting on principle. Others contend that the motivation is irrelevant, that disloyalty is disloyalty regardless of justification, and that the harm caused is the same whether the spy was motivated by greed or by ideology. Ana Montes, in choosing ideology over loyalty, forced this question into sharp relief. The damage she caused is documented and undeniable. For 16 years, Ana Montes systematically undermined U.S. intelligence operations targeting Cuba. She provided information that allowed Cuba to protect its own operations and to neutralize U.S. intelligence sources. She shaped analytical products in ways that served Cuban interests rather than providing objective assessments to U.S. policymakers. She compromised colleagues who worked alongside her, never suspecting she was serving a foreign government. She caused pain to her family, who had to reconcile their love for her with the reality of her deception. And she potentially contributed to harm suffered by intelligence officers and sources whose identities and activities she exposed, though the full extent of that harm remains classified. Ana Montes made choices. She chose to engage with Cuban intelligence recruiters. She chose to provide classified information. She chose to continue the relationship for 16 years. She chose to lie to her colleagues, to her family, about what she was doing and why. Those choices were hers, and she bore responsibility for them. But she made those choices within a context, a Cold War that had officially ended but whose dynamics persisted, a relationship between the United States and Cuba characterized by mutual hostility and suspicion, an intelligence environment where both sides competed to recruit assets and collect information. Those contextual factors did not cause her choices, but they created the conditions in which those choices became possible and, from her perspective at the time, justified. The legal system judged her actions as criminal and punished her with 20 years in prison. History's judgment will be more complex. Some will view her as a traitor who compromised her country for an authoritarian regime. Others will view her as someone who, however misguided, acted according to deeply held principles. Most will fall somewhere in between, acknowledging both the sincerity of her convictions and the wrongness of her actions. Ana Montes was 28 years old when she agreed to spy for Cuba, believing she was serving justice by helping a small nation defend itself against American aggression. She was 44 when she was arrested, standing in her apartment doorway as FBI agents took her into custody. She was 65 when she was released from prison, having spent 20 years incarcerated for choices she apparently still believed were right. In between those moments lay 16 years of systematic deception. Years during which she maintained a double existence so thoroughly that even those closest to her had no idea of her true loyalties. She shaped intelligence products that influenced U.S. policy. She compromised operations and sources. She met with Cuban handlers in foreign cities, encoded messages on public payphones, listened to encrypted broadcasts on shortwave radio, and all the while maintained the appearance of a dedicated public servant working diligently in America's interests. The photograph of Ana Montes being led from her apartment in handcuffs that morning, 10 days after September 11th had plunged the nation into crisis, captured a moment that marked the end of one of the most damaging penetrations of U.S. intelligence in modern history. But photographs capture only surfaces. They cannot show the 16 years of deception that preceded that moment, the classified briefings where she shaped policy while secretly serving another government, the agents and sources whose safety she compromised, the family relationships that would never recover, or the ideological certainty that allowed her to sustain her duplicity without apparent guilt. That morning on New Hampshire Avenue, Ana Montes accepted the consequences of choices she had made years before and had sustained across 16 years of double existence. For the intelligence officers she compromised, for the Cuban refugees whose cooperation she exposed, for the family members who discovered they never really knew her, and for the intelligence community that must live with the vulnerability she revealed, there would be no such peace. Only questions about how someone so trusted could be so thoroughly disloyal, and whether others like her remain undetected, sitting in offices with security clearances and access to classified information, quietly serving foreign governments while wearing the mask of American loyalty.